experience with goals, you obviously have to have financial goals or operational goals from the top, but how you implement the goals, what the day-to-day, weekly, those are local. So that's really the key, is can you have enough top-down alignment and also bottom-up at the same time? And that's why it all comes down to management, because good leaders have the ability to empower people to set their own goals in the context of what they're trying to accomplish. If you look at what a lot of the research that's been done with OKRs and other forms of goals, that's where they kind of come down to. All right, so that's number 3. I think that's number 3. Are we on number 3? Number 2. Let's go to number 3. Number 3 is the work environment. I'm just going to go fairly quickly through this because it's getting a little bit late, but 4 issues that come up very, very regularly on this. Number 1 is flexibility. A lot of you mentioned that. I think a couple of you mentioned working at home at IBM, all sorts of flexible work experiences, getting to work late if there's a commute, giving people time to get to work, letting them flex their hours, obviously is a big issue. Building a workplace that's productive. Now, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about these open workplaces. Where I live, we just went through a massive, in the tech industry, redesign of virtually every building that in the San Francisco Bay Area has turned into a beautiful office with no walls that's noisy and collaborative, and everybody's jammed in next to each other with computers elbow to elbow. And so what people do is they put their headphones on and they try to hide and they ignore everybody else, or they don't come in the office and they work from home because they can't get anything done in the office. And in fact, it was so bad, I went to a tech startup a couple weeks ago that the whole company was in one giant room, and they actually went out and bought soundproof telephone booths, so people could go in the telephone booths and actually relax and get a little bit of time to themselves. So I think this is a process of design thinking and being careful. I think I have this chart in here. Yeah, here it is. I mean, Deloitte's done a lot of work on this, because we have Deloitte, I guess it's not we anymore, but Deloitte has, enormously complex, flexible work situations for all these consultants flying all over the world. And you can go into Deloitte office, you can go into a private office, you can go into a public office. There's open areas like Starbucks where you can sit around and drink coffee with each other. And Deloitte put together this model, which I think is kind of interesting, to let you kind of design think what the office should be like. I don't think you should assume that because it looks good, everybody should have an open office, or everybody should have a private office. I think you have to make some design decisions based on the characteristics of the work. I'll give you an example of this. Big, very successful, I won't mention the name of the company, Silicon Valley, legacy technology company, been around for a long, long time, very successful company, traditional workforce, lots of software engineers and telecommunications engineers that have been there for a long time. If you walked around in the office, you would say this looks like a company from the 1970s and the 1980s. They have the sort of the brown cubicles and the old-fashioned office layouts, and it's kind of quiet. You don't hear a lot of people talking. And they went and they bought a startup in San Francisco, very, very expensive startup that had a gourmet chef, a big, gourmet dining area, served free breakfast, free lunch. By the way, in San Francisco, how many of you have like free breakfast in your office? Is that a big trend here? Well, in San Francisco, everybody gets free breakfast because that way they get people to come into the office earlier, and then they have free dinner because they get them to stay in the office later. And I'm not kidding. I mean, it's like I don't think you could hire people if you didn't have free breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I don't think anybody would go work for you. And so anyway, so these guys bought this company in San Francisco that had all these wonderful benefits, and they had these really, really fancy open offices, and it was a very highly engaged startup. And one of these senior executives visited this startup and said, "Oh my God, our offices in San Jose are so old. Let's redesign the offices. And they decided unilaterally to redesign the offices in an open fashion, similar to the offices in this startup. And they had a revolution. The engineers hated it. They didn't like the space. They didn't like the noise. They didn't want to be around each other. They wanted to work by themselves. They liked their cubicles. And they ended up having to go back and redesign the offices the way they were before. So my message here is that you need to think about this. This is not always going to be as easy, as simple as you might imagine. Diversity. I mentioned this earlier. This is the data from Deloitte Australia. It's a little hard to read on this chart. But I think diversity and inclusion is an environmental issue. I think it falls into the category of environment. And I don't know, sort of what the maturity of the diversity and inclusion marketplace is in Russia, but in the United States, it is a work in process. It is not a solved problem. We've done 2 or 3 big studies of this, and every time we do it, people overstate their level of maturity. They tell us that they're very sophisticated and very advanced, and then when we actually look at the data, they're not. And so what I've found, and I'll just give you my couple of little tips on this, it's a big topic, is that the most successful, highly inclusive, diverse companies, first of all, it does start at the top. It's leadership, it comes from leadership behavior, leadership communications, but they treat it not like an HR program where there's a head of diversity who's part of the HR department who has all these programs and ERGs and training and all that. They treat it more like, almost like a safety program, that a non-diverse workforce or a biased recruiting slate or a promotion process that's not fair and transparent is a compliance violation, and we're not going to let it happen. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the oil companies that's a very, very diverse and inclusive company, I won't mention the name of the company, very great place to work, very high employment brand company, has what they call diversity councils, or maybe they're called inclusion councils. I don't know what they're called, but every time there's a management or people-related decision in that company, a raise, a promotion, a job assignment, a hire, any manager that makes that decision has to pass it by a diversity council that looks at that decision based on the diversity of that work group. That's a separate group of people that are almost like a check and balance on the power of the manager. In other words, they're taking power away from the manager and they're putting it in the hands of this group. And these diversity councils are very powerful in this company. And any decision that the diversity council, first of all, it's an embarrassment for the manager if they make a decision that isn't an inclusive decision, or if they're not paying people fairly. And the second is, if the manager insists on making a decision and maybe they promote a white person instead of a black person or an Asian person or whatever it may be, the council is entitled to go back to that manager a year later and ask them, did you make the right decision? And should the minority candidate now be considered for that position, even though they weren't when you made the decision before? That's an example of making diversity and inclusion a really almost like a safety program in a company. And so, it's a very big issue with women right now. It's a big issue with age. Where I live in the San Francisco area, there's a lot of age bias. And obviously there's many other factors. So I think this goes into the category of environment. Fourth one. I talked about health and well-being. I think we talked about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but let me just show you a couple pictures. This is an interesting chart that I think will give you some things to think about. As I've studied the well-being market, and it's a big space. I mean, this is like a really, really big, complicated space. There's a lot of things going on. In most companies, the well-being program started as some sort of a health or fitness program designed to reduce insurance costs or improve safety. And then after a few years of that, the company realized, wait, you know, this is actually a productivity program. And it's actually going to improve productivity because we'll get people to be a little more awake in the office, and they'll be a little bit more energetic, and they'll be able to contribute better, and we'll give them a little bit more, you know, oxygen, and they'll have better sleep. And then they realize, you know what, it's really a performance program. The well-being program is about performance. And if you look at the companies that have been doing well-being programs for, you know, many, many years, they're doing all this stuff. But this is what they're really focused on. What are the things that we can do in our workplace that will allow people to come to work, ready to perform? And that's really where I think this is going. And that's why I talked about productivity earlier. If your well-being program is a benefit and it's looked upon as a health and wellness benefit, you may not get used. I mean, I think a couple of you have said that. And it may be that you have a lot of things that people aren't aware of. But if you think about it as a performance program of finely tuned tapestry of solutions that allow people to perform well on the job, you're going to probably find that it's a very, very high ROI program. While I was at Deloitte, we went through this entire journey. The first year I was Deloitte, the well-being program was an anti-burnout program because a lot of people were quitting because they were doing too much travel. And so they started this massive program of monitoring people's travel and warning people when they were on the road too much. And then the second year they said, okay, we're going to stop sending people on the road on Sunday night because at Deloitte, most of the consultants go on site and they leave on Sunday, so it messes up their weekend. And then they're there till Thursday and they come home on Friday. So they really are working 6 days a week and they're not with their families. So they changed that, and then they went through these iterations of creating more flexibility. And eventually, when I left, right around the time I left, the well-being program was all focused on human performance and teaching people how to self-assess what. So anyway, so that's kind of one of the things to think about in well-being. I'm not going to be able to solve this for you because it's too complicated. This is a matrix that we developed at Deloitte for all the different things to consider. I won't take you through this right now, but I'll make sure you get these slides somehow, at the end of this. And there's a bunch of these tools all over the world that is really a behavior modification app. And more of these things from the consumer world, like Headspace and all the tools that have been sold and given away to consumers, are now making it into the corporate world, and they're really, really working. And people are really getting a lot of value out of them. By the way, one of the other things that I think is going to happen, just as sort of a heads up, is a lot of these independent technologies in HR are starting to come together. Last month, SAP announced that they are building a well-being app because it's part of their talent management system. About 2 months ago, a company that does social recognition acquired a company that does continuous performance management. Most of the continuous performance management tools are now shopping around for learning systems. All of this technology, all of these these are sort of separate markets for technology, are all coming together. And I think that's going to be kind of an interesting thing to watch over the next couple of years as the HR technology evolves. Okay. Number 5 is growth. And I showed you in Maslow's hierarchy how important this is, and let me just touch on this for a couple of minutes. There's really 4 issues here: support on the job, career mobility, self-directed learning, and your learning culture. Let me just touch on these because we've done a lot of research on this, and it's getting a little bit late. First of all, I like to draw pictures. I'm an engineer. I like to draw charts because sometimes it helps people understand things. I think if you really look at what happens in a job, and I went through a little bit of this morning on the learning session, is we go through these fits and starts where, you know, things are going well, and then all of a sudden, you know, I hit a plateau, and, you know, I need to learn something new, or there's something about the job I don't understand, and maybe I get a mentor. Those little intersection points are really important for you to understand. Now, if you have a good manager will understand that and will inject on the support training. But the solution to this is another design thinking problem. Getting closer to the productivity of your people and understanding what happens at these different stages. Let me give you an example of this. There's a couple of you, I know a lot of you work in banks. One of the highest turnover, high-risk roles in a bank is the branch or teller or whatever you call retail workers. Retail workers in banks don't usually make a huge amount of money. They're fairly well trained, but there's a lot of turnover, and you know they're customer-facing roles. They have very important training requirements, and it costs the bank a lot of money to turn those roles over. So there was a Canadian bank that was looking at this, you know, pretty significant problem of branch turnover. And this is true in most sales organizations, retail sales organizations. And they were doing a lot of onboarding, and they realized, you know, after they, you know, did more and more onboarding, that the problem wasn't going away. They decided to get involved in a design thinking exercise, and they studied the first 2 years' experience in the branch. Not the first 2 months, but the first 2 years. What happens the first day? What happens the first week? What happens the first month? What happens the first quarter? What happens the first 6 months? What are the moments that matter, the important transitions that take place in the retail business during that period of time? And what they ended up doing is determining that there's a pretty predictable level of things that are going to happen, and they can actually get ahead of those and design interventions to prevent people from, you know, tripping on these little steps when they go up this path. And so they ended up, after they studied it, and it took them a few months to study these transition points, they ended up building an app, an onboarding app now, that when you go and work for this bank, it gives you very carefully timed interventions based on the activities that you're expected to do at different points of time during your first 2 years. It gives you some, you know, training on the systems. It introduces you to different people. It gives you exercises. They put gamification on it. Had a dramatic impact on performance and engagement. And that's design thinking, and that's really learning on the job. And you won't be able to do that unless you get your hands dirty and really understand what's going on. Another example of that is Fidelity. Did any of you work for Fidelity? I don't know if Fidelity's out here, but Fidelity is a very big financial services company in the United States. And they have a philosophy at Fidelity that anybody who goes anywhere at Fidelity starts in a call center. They really want you to work in a call center and get to know what it's like to help customers over the phone. So the call centers are very important roles. And they found, using analytics, like we were talking about earlier, that about 15 months into your call center experience, there's a very high turnover rate. It's about 15 to 18 months, somewhere around a year and a half. Because you get burned out and the job's kind of repetitive, and you know you want to get so they went through one of these design thinking exercises and, you know, studied what was happening and why people were leaving after 15 to 18 months, and they designed an intervention that after 13 months or 14 months, they developed a whole career portal. If you've worked in the call center for about a year, a little bit over a year, then you get access to this career planning tool that allows you to automatically look for other roles in the call center so that you can decide what you want to do next. Because they knew that was about the right period of time when people were ready for a transition. That's another example of using this kind of an approach to really, really change the employee experience. And again, they had a huge improvement in productivity and engagement and retention. Actually, I'll just show you this slide for those. Any of you were in my thing earlier today, I went through this. But the learning and development profession is really changing. And if you don't have a self-authoring, knowledge-sharing system, you should build one. Allow people to share content with each other. Most of the knowledge that you need to build, most of the training you need to build to make any one of these operational jobs more effective is already in your company. You don't have to hire people to design it. It's there, but you have to share it. And so there's a whole new breed of tools that's been developed to help you build these, micro-learning types of activities in work. We talked about this extensively this morning in the presentation that I did in the other room. So that's another opportunity you have to really change the employee experience. By the way, the other reason that micro-learning is so important is young people, and I mentioned this in the beginning, when they come to work at your company, if they don't feel like they're learning something, they don't want to be there. I mean, it's a dead-end job as far as they're concerned. So they're going to be looking for things to learn, and they're going to be looking for this kind of content. And so this is not just a productivity tool, this is an engagement tool. And the other point in the area of mobility and development is talent mobility. Does your company have a culture that allows people to move to new roles without fear or risk of failure? Not all companies do. A lot of companies don't. I was, in one of the largest telecommunication companies in Asia a couple of months ago, and I was talking to them about this, and I asked them, I said, do people ever move from sales to operations and from operations to finance and back and forth? They said, no. The best way for you to change departments in our company is to quit and go back and apply for a new job, because we don't do that here. And I said, why not? I said, and they just were scratching their head. They really didn't know why, but it's just years and years and years of culture. And, every company's different, but a lot of companies have ingrained cultures that don't move people from role to role. I would say right now, though, almost every organization I talk to is trying to build more internal talent mobility, because that's the only way you're going to train people to grow if you can't hire. So this has got to be something you've got to work on. Probably one of the biggest things that facilitates talent mobility is the reward system. Will a hiring manager be penalized for hiring an internal candidate who's less qualified than an external candidate? If so, nobody's going to move around inside the company. If they're encouraged to hire internal candidates, if you have a culture of internal mobility, if people are rewarded for moving around from role to role, then that will happen in a much more facilitated way. So you need to think about, what are you rewarding people for? And is internal mobility rewarded? And if I change jobs, if I work in HR and say I want to take a rotational assignment in sales, and I go work maybe I work in sales training for a while, and then I realize I don't like that very much, and I want to go back to the HR department, and the HR department says, sorry, your job's gone. You don't have a job here anymore. I mean, that's not going to help. So there's all sorts of things like that that are cultural that have to be put in place to really facilitate talent mobility. And I don't know how many of you are working on this, but this comes up in almost every major meeting I have with an organization. Okay, and the last one I want to talk about, because it's getting a little bit late and I'm getting a little bit tired, and there's a million topics and lots of books and magazines and competency models and training programs. I mean, this is a $14 billion industry. But I would say that, there's a couple of principles of leadership that seem to come up in most of the research on engagement. Number one is what I talked about a little bit earlier, is having a broader mission and purpose, and the leaders really understanding that and communicating that. Number two is investing in people. Now, I was when we were talking in the learning and development session this morning, a whole series of people started asking me, how do you compute the ROI of training? And, I always take that as a bad sign when somebody asks me that question, because it's a sign that either the training function has not demonstrated enough value and people are asking them to cost justify it, or the senior leadership really doesn't believe in training people, and they're sort of begrudgingly putting money into it, but in the back of their mind they're thinking, we should spend that money on something else. Those are both kind of bad signs. I think the research that I've done and my experience with training is if you focus on the right problem and you're investing in programs that are focused on the most important issues. You can't train everybody on everything, believe me. I mean, one of the problems with training is there's too much of it. Focus on the most strategic things. The ROI of training is much, much higher than you realize. Because it isn't just training, it's a cultural tool, it's an engagement tool, it connects people to each other, they get to know the organization better. Training is incredibly high ROI. All of the companies we studied that survive recessions, that turn around during bad times, that reinvent themselves, have a learning culture at their core. When you lose your learning culture, you lose your flexibility, you lose your ability to grow. So that's really important, that investment in people. And it does come to leadership. Will the leadership in your company invest in people even if you're having a bad quarter or a bad year? I mean, if they cut all the training budget, the first thing to go, people see that. That's a bad sign. So that's number 2. Number 3 is transparency. Highly engaged companies have leaders that are out there talking, meeting with people, spending time with people, explaining why the company's doing what it's doing, clearly telling stories. I know there's cultures in different companies where a lot of things are done in secret, but today the expectation amongst most employees is that most decisions are going to be as transparent as possible. And the 4th is being an inspiring leader and just being able to create a sense of vision in the organization that makes people want to join. That's what I look at Mark Benioff. If you ever listen to Mark Benioff from Salesforce talk, I mean, you just can't not want to go work for that guy just listening to him. I don't know that if he's deeply involved in all the technologies that Salesforce builds, but he's taken that company on a mission that people want to. Look at Elon Musk. I mean, I don't know what your opinion is of Tesla, but I've been to Tesla. I've met people there. I know people who work there. It's not an easy place to work. It's a little bit chaotic, and they're doing a lot of things at the same time. But the passion and the mission and the culture of that place is so strong. People just love working there, even though it's a hard place to work. And Tesla's worth, I don't know what its market cap is now. It was higher, but at one point Tesla was worth as much as GM. So those are some of the characteristics of leadership.